Hi, hello everybody. My name is Luisa Ferrario, and today I'm here with my dear colleague, Jen Rice. And so we are going to talk about something very, very interesting that could really make the difference for you, you are, whether you're an entrepreneur or a CEO or a leader. You might find this very, very useful and interesting to know in order to grow your business, scale your business, and also to develop your leadership. So let me introduce you to Jane Rice. So Jane is the founder of Groundbreaking. This is the name of her organization, and she's a strategist and a coach, and she works with leaders and entrepreneurs who have a neurodivergent brain, and she helps them to grow their business and to scale their business. So this is a very interesting topic for me, Jane. How are you doing?
And I'm good, thank you.
So thanks for being here today with me. So Jen, we are here today to talk about leadership and neurodivergent brains. And so first and foremost, what do you mean about neurodivergent brains? I'm very curious about that.
Yes. Well, I didn't even know I had a neurodivergent brain until fairly recently, and especially women, we tend to go much later in life before realizing that we actually can be different from everyone else. So neurodivergence is essentially recognizes like biology, when we talk about the diversity of species, that there's no real right or wrong way for a brain to work. There's simply a lot of many different ways for it to work. But within our culture of, do and goal orientation and, being
performance.
Yes, it's all about performance. Then sometimes there are certain brain wirings that aren't compatible with this culture that we have built. And those can be ADHD, autism, dyslexia, bipolar, and they're often talked about very separately, but they also can share some of the same struggles. So I like to not overly specialize because that is a function of a neurotypical brain. And so I like to look for patterns and how things are similar.
Yeah. I am dyslexic, and I really like to, it's not something that I like. Basically, my brain works like that. So I see patterns everywhere. Yeah. And so this is also very easy for me to use when I work with entrepreneurs and CEOs. And because I can easily help them to strategize, to see things, to see the big picture, and to, relate things that seems to be so far from each other. Yeah. So I'm very curious about another thing. What are the signs that we most commonly can find as CEOs or entrepreneurs that tell us that we have a neurodivergent brain?
Yeah, I think often we feel. Let's talk about whether we realize we're neurodivergent as leaders, and also how to recognize it in others. So we realize it when we feel like we're different than everybody else, when we're kind of struggling because best practices tell us to work one way and everything in us just feels wrong. So those are definitely some of the signs. What is shared across neurodivergence can be executive function, a weaker executive function, which essentially is the part of our brain that's like the secretary. Neurotypicals have, imagine, a secretary in their brains that helps them get stuff done, be disciplined, override impulsivity, can, let's say, recognize maybe when they're talking too much. And so these can be signs, right? So often decreased executive function means the part of our brain that essentially moderates impulsive behavior, planning and strategy and organization can be inhibited. Time management can be inhibited. So often that can be a sign. I lose things all the time. There's also an interesting phenomenon of the concept of time, which is now and not now. That can be very an ADHD type of brain, but I think it's related to executive function, which means everything has to be done right now. Otherwise, I'm going to forget it, or it's just going to vanish. And so those are some of the signs. And as you talked about, seeing patterns. One thing that I have realized through my own career is that my brain tends to see how things are connected. So it's how I've always worked in strategy. So my background's 30 years of customer-centric strategy. My purpose really is to get a business that is currently very siloed and fragmented into working like a whole system so that you can attract and keep customers. Now, often I worked with clients who had no idea what I was talking about. They like the silos. It makes sense to them. And that's a really big difference between a neurotypical and a neurodivergent brain, is this world of specialization and putting things into boxes was designed by the neurotypical brain, which is like 80% of the population. They don't see anything wrong with this. And if you're listening and you're neurotypical and you don't see anything wrong with, boxes and org structures and working in straight lines, then you're neurotypical, and that's cool. There are people who are maybe on your team or should be on your team who see the world in a completely different way. We see how everything could be connected, how everything could work as a holistic system. So these are people like Steve Jobs. You want to know why Apple was the first company to hit $1 trillion in valuation? He built essentially a system that works more like the laws of nature, like gravity attracting entire global ecosystems. And if you want to be really disruptive and really scale, you need a neurodivergent on your team, because we see how the system can work so much more effectively and efficiently.
Oh, that's so fascinating. I can see myself in many of the things that you just shared. And what happens when, so I can see two different scenarios. So the first one is what happens when we have this kind of a brain configuration, and none on our team has it. Okay, and it might be that we are leaders in a company and we are not able to directly hire people on our team, so we are assigned and people on our team, and so we have the team and we have to deal with it. So what do we do? Is it just a matter of changing the way we communicate? Is there anything practical that we can do? So this is the first scenario that I see, then I will go to the second one.
Yes. So I think what's really important about this whole diversity, let's talk about diversity. And most diversity programs focus on what you can see. Oh, you're different race, color, gender, sexual orientation, whatever. But what really makes us different is invisible. It's what's under the water, it's the iceberg. And a lot of that is how we're wired and how we think. So if there isn't a knowledge about how different brains are wired, there's also not an understanding of not only somebody's superpowers, which might be, you don't even know what they are because you don't have them, but also their weaknesses that drive you nuts. So I'll give you a really good example. I worked at a management consulting firm trained by, ex-McKinsey people. And I got my ass kicked all the time. And I was publicly shamed in front of my teams because what's interesting is they hired me because they knew I was creative and they felt that they had over-rotated to the left brain. But they just dropped me in with no training, no support, no nothing. And I was actually shamed in front of my teams because I didn't think in a linear fashion. And often neurodivergents will actually think from the bottom up. We're pattern matchers. So what we can do often is consume a lot of information and see the patterns and work our way up to conclusions. A neurotypical brain starts with a theory, a hypothesis, and then can like do some research. So there's a really big difference in how we approach problem solving. That environment was so toxic for me. It would actually cause trauma. I'm glad that I stayed because I learned some really valuable things in terms of being able to put structure around my intuitive thoughts. But it was really unhealthy. So if you, going back to your question, if you are neurodivergent, I think it's really important to understand how your brain works, how you solve problems, how you communicate, because often we can ramble, we can have unorganized thoughts. And to a neurotypical, you're coming out as just really stupid. So if you're not, laying things out in a linear fashion that they can understand, there can be communication problems and perception problems. So taking a step back, really understanding your own thought process, laying it out in a way that, a linear thinker can understand, I think is number one. It's a really big one. And then helping people understand that, you see the world differently. There will be scenarios where the way you see the world is threatening to them. They like their lanes, they like their fiefdoms. And you're coming in saying like, there's a different way to do it. It makes them really uncomfortable. So I would also say, try to find your people, or try to find a team that really understands and welcomes the way that you think. Because really in any team, you need someone who's a fire starter, the idea generator, the one who's connecting the dots and seeing what's possible. But then you also need a neurotypical person who's like the person who's going to actually make stuff happen and, operationalize things. And then sometimes you need a sense maker, that person who is like, okay, I see what you're trying to do, and I understand how you're thinking, and maybe there's, a way to kind of bridge the gap. And if you're a team that's committed to neurodiversity, I think making sure that you have that kind of representation is really helpful.
Oh, this is so good to learn, because I'm thinking about so many articles and posts and research that I read about diversity and inclusion, and most of the times, basically always, I do not see any of those information mentioned there. So so as you were saying at the beginning, we just look at the diversity and inclusion from the outside, and from the things that we can probably just sense with the 5 senses, but not with the 6 and the 7th senses. And so this is very, very useful. And again, I can relate it to what you shared, because I have been part of teams where I felt that I was not well welcomed, not because I didn't have the skills. I had all the skills and they were appreciating so much, but when I was sharing my skills in the way that was really easy for me and normal for me to share, it was never good enough, and it was not compliant with the expectations that the team leader had. And another thing that I noticed is that, for instance, so I have been facilitating people for probably 30 years, and especially in the last 20 years, I started noticing that for me, it was very difficult to sit while facilitating. And even when I was not the facilitator and I was in the audience, one thing that I started to recognize was that I couldn't understand completely what was said because my body needed to move, you know. And so from a certain point on, I started sitting in the last row instead of in the first one, because I love so much to sit in the first row, but I know that I can be a distraction for people because I get my phone and I drink water. So I do all the things that you're not, you shouldn't say like that, you know? And so I sit in the last row and I ask the permission before, of course, if it is a small facilitation group, and I ask the permission to ask and to go around always in the back of the room. And because otherwise I can't concentrate. I can't get the same thing that other people that are all writing down. I can't write down. No. At the end, I think that I grasp the essence, and this is, and I embody it. So this is the way I know that my learning works, and I know that I can help a lot of people who work in the same way, because of course there is a lot of similarities, and we understand each other without any overstructure to get rid of in order to communicate. Yeah. So when you are on the other side, when you are a team member and you have neurotypical brained CEO or a team leader, what do? How do you make sure that you are respected for your diversity, and you are and that your genius can go through your work and get to the teamwork and add to that?
Well, I think it really depends on how the team is structured. So you hit something on the head, which is we're going to work differently. I'm at a standing desk. I need to stand. I need to move around. I think better when I move. Being chained to a desk, working at an 8-hour stretch, like, does not work for me. So there really needs to be a recognition. And I think I'm grateful for the silver lining of COVID to start this trend towards work from home, work how you want, flex working. We really need that. We also often are distracted, easily distracted, and overly sensitive to our environment. That's a very common thing. So allowing noise canceling headphones or allowing us to work from home is going to be super important. So a lot of these things come down to, you really need to know yourself and stand in your power. So this is one thing that I didn't know when I was working for that super toxic firm. Yeah. So all I felt is, I'm broken. This company has made me feel utterly broken and not smart for the first time in my life. Like, there is something wrong with me. So, I just struggled to try to learn their way of doing things and to fit in, because I thought I was the problem. So if you're listening, you are not the problem. You are a brilliant, creative, visionary ideator who has something incredibly valuable to bring to the world. And you need to really pay attention to how you're feeling in your body. What feels like a hell yes? What makes you contract and like, oh, I can't do it this way? And really start getting in tune with who you are, what your strengths are, what you need, and clearly communicate that. If you're a leader, you're a CEO, this is going to be so important, because if you're not really clear on how your brain works and how it's different than your team's, you might come across as a loose cannon. You might, especially ADHD, of which there's a lot. I mean, probably people with ADHD are 300% more likely to start their own businesses. And nearly, I would say almost half of all entrepreneurs have biologically based kind of brain wiring, brain differences. So we can be inconsistent, we can change our minds. What's really different, and this is what affects strategic planning, is that our brains tend to be divergent, literally divergent, meaning we're constantly, the concept of diverging and converging. So we're constantly diverging. Every step forward we take, we get new data, new information, and that new information forms a new pattern. And then that means the old pattern's out the window. Oh, wait, no, I've got the next big thing, right? So when you're trying to lead a team, this starts becoming extremely difficult. So I actually have a process where I help divergent founders create their niche based on a who, not on a what. Because also we get really bored easily. So if we're we don't want to get trapped into a niche, because I'm going to change my mind in 6 months or in 2 years, that's going to be out the window. But if we can anchor on a who are we, what really lights us up, and how can we design our company for the common ground that we share with our best fit team members, employees, customers, then we can start innovating all the whats. By the way, this is how Apple works. It's how Virgin works. It's how Nike works. It's how every single high growth brand works, which is you take something like Apple. Steve Jobs designed for himself. He designed for someone who thinks different, who wants total control over technology, who's dazzled by elegant aesthetic design, who's a rebel, right? He designed for himself. And then everybody gets magnetized. So you're no longer chasing. And this is the brilliance of neurodivergent founders, because if you really know yourself, so Branson's done the same thing. He's got 49 different separate companies under the same Virgin umbrella that serves rebels with usually a very unique customer experience. So you get into this point where you can continually balance focus with freedom and flexibility to innovate without having to reinvent the wheel all the time. So this has been what I've done for 30 years, is optimizing companies to work like a system based on human principles. And I finally realized just a few years ago why I felt like I was beating my head against a wall, because neurotypical brains don't think this way. So now I am serving people who are like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of pulling together these kind of best practices and principles and rewriting the rule book for people with our brains.
Yeah, Jen, we need you. Absolutely, absolutely. So I know that you have something you are working on, and can you please share something about that with us? Because
yes,
I think that there are a lot of folks out there who might really be interested in getting in contact with you and working with you.
Yeah, thank you. My basic premise is that best practices do not work for us, and we need to rewrite the rule book, especially since so many of us are entrepreneurs and founders with big visions to scale. So what I am working on is essentially how we rewrite that rule book and how can we create a center of excellence. So if the listeners are familiar with Forrester, Gardner, I actually used to work at Forrester. So I was immersed in neurotypical best practices that didn't make sense to me, the way that it was designed. So I'm actually looking for an initial group of 10 quirky-brained, innovative founders who, A, want to get unstuck and scale using neurodivergent principles, but also help co-create these practices, or not best practices, but best principles, because we know that, there's no one right way to do things, but there are some common principles that we can use. So yes, that is my ultimate vision, and I'm starting with a very curated group of 10. So wow, if any of this sounds good to anyone listening here, I'd love to chat with you.
Yeah. And where can we find you?
You can find me, actually my website is begroundbreaking.co. And we can also just put the contact information in the comments.
Absolutely.
But yeah, absolutely.
We will do that. I'm so excited for this conversation we had. And I hope that at a certain point, we can go maybe a little bit deeper on some topics that might be of interest. As I was sharing with you before we started recording this conversation, I really like to help people educate themselves around topics that might not be so that we might be not so familiar with, and I think that really a lot of people can get interesting information out of the conversation we just had, and I hope that it will spark their parts of brain that can relate to what we talked about. Any last thought, any wishes, anything that you would like to offer our listener and watchers before we end this conversation?
No, I don't, but I've really enjoyed this chat. I really appreciate you having me on.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's see what we can create together from here on. And I'm wishing you a lovely day ahead, and I'll talk to you soon.
Excellent.
Ciao.